Hello, and welcome to Baha'i Blogcast, with me, your host, Rainn Wilson. This is where I interview members of the Baha'i Faith and other friends from all over the world about their hearts and minds and souls, their spiritual journeys, what they're interested in, and what makes them tick. Enjoy. Welcome back, everyone. I'm here with Sean Hinton, part 2. Sean, so great to have you back on the talking machine.
Well, it's lovely to be there. I had so much fun and didn't give you much of a word in edgewise last time, so we figured we'd better talk some more and cover some other things.
Yes, I'm excited to talk to you about other aspects of your life, not just the Mongolia chapter of your life, but so many other chapters and so many other great stories. So I'm excited to dig into some of that.
Me too. And it's such a great, you have such interesting people on this podcast that I'd love to talk about some more of the things that you cover on this around the Baha'i Faith and everything else. But I actually want to ask you, because since we spoke, we got a bit interrupted, and
yes.
You were out of town, and you've had quite a few weeks. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. Yes. Thanks for asking. I don't know if I should thank you for asking, but I appreciate you asking. Yeah. So my father passed away since we spoke last 2 or 3 weeks ago. He had a small heart attack and was going to go in for surgery, and he needed quadruple bypass surgery, and which has a pretty high success rate. And so I flew up to Wenatchee, Washington, a small town in Washington State where he lives. And I was fortunate to spend several hours with him before he went into the operating room. And basically, the long and short of it is that he didn't make it. I won't get into all the nitty gritty of it, but his heart was in too bad of a shape. His arterial sclerosis was too far gone, and they had a lot of complications. And he was in critical care, unconscious, in critical condition for about 2 days afterwards. And then they were losing him, and we just let him go in the hospital room. That was pretty recently. That was about 2 weeks ago. And then we buried him about 8 or 9 days ago. And it was the first kind of major death that I experienced in my family. And it's been heartbreaking and also spiritually really challenging and uplifting at the same time. Have you lost anyone in your family ever, Sean?
I have, and actually just the most recent sort of experience of it was during this pandemic, when the son of my best friend in the world passed away, and a young man who was deeply close to our family, the closest friend of one of my daughters, and through reasons of the sort of pandemic right now, we were separated. We were unable to be with these dear friends of ours. We were unable to hold them and to share with them, except through prayer, except through sharing passages from the writings. And, because you and I were expecting to talk, and you were valiantly imagining that we might arrange our session in between, your visits to the hospital.
I assumed, I assumed that his operation would be successful, because most are. And so I thought that we could, while he was in the recovery room, you and I could finish our conversation, but it was not to be.
And instead, you and I found ourselves trading messages with prayers, and that was all I had in corresponding with my friend at this time, and that was all you and I could do. And I just wonder what those were that kept you going in those last few weeks. How did that make part of it?
Yeah, there was some very deep prayer. There was certainly a lot of long healing prayers while he was in the hospital, and a lot of prayers upon his passing. And the flood of prayers that came in for him from his hundreds of friends, Baha'i and otherwise, were really powerful and moving and beautiful. And there was a lot of praying going on around Robert Wilson. And but the thing, Sean, that I wanted to bring up was, for me, one of the most kind of beautiful experiences of my life was preparing the body for burial. So myself and my stepmom, his wife Carla, we researched the Baha'i burial, and we bought a shroud, 9 yards of linen, and had the funeral home lay his body on the shroud on a table, and we washed the body. We put a ring on his finger. I forget the exact phrase that's on the ring, but it's a short prayer about how we were all, under God's will and God's guidance. Um, and we washed and prepared the his body that he had ridden around the world in for 78 and a half years, and it was devastating. We were weeping, and at the same time, it was incredibly healing to have this tender kind of honoring of his body, the washing of it, the preparing of it, the saying prayers over it, the wrapping it carefully in the shroud. And later on, when it was in the casket, and the casket was lowered into the ground, it was so powerful to know that that body had been prepared, and we had kind of witnessed it as a vessel, because that's what it is. It's a soul growing vessel that, he rode around in, that we're all riding around in. And it was devastating and really powerful at the same time.
I I have never experienced that. And I guess, like many people, I might have read about that and heard about that and kind of wondered and thought it sounded like a, a what is the white linen and the silk and the wrapping and the body and the ring, and but the way you're describing it, it's the act of doing it, the being there together, not the
Mm.
materiality of that. Are there other? Would you talk a little bit about the rest of the sort of Baha'i funeral and those things, and how you experience those?
Yeah, well, there's not a whole lot else to a Baha'i funeral. Obviously, you don't get the body embalmed. Um, you don't get the body cremated. There's writings in the Baha'i Faith about, the body going back into the earth and reconnecting with the earth from where it came. There is the funeral prayer that is said during the washing of the body, and that same funeral prayer that's said collectively at the funeral itself. And it's very repetitive. It's these long phrases, and it's incredibly powerful and hypnotic. In some ways, it's like the long healing prayer that has these kind of repetitive refrains. Um, I don't know what makes it so powerful and so important, but you feel a certain power behind it. And I just think in terms of the preparing of the body, we're so cut off from death in our modern society. Um, our ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years used to prepare bodies for burial. I mean, you can see this in the earliest evidences of human civilization when they unearth bodies, and they're prepared in all kinds of ways. They're prepared in shrouds, and they're wrapped in their finest clothes, and they're things that on their journey that they're sent with, they're given physical items and totems to continue their physical journey. And it's really just been in the last 100, 200 years that we've kind of dissociated ourselves from that process. And this whole idea of embalming is just grotesque. You'd fill a dead body with chemicals so that it doesn't rot. It doesn't literally makes no sense whatsoever. Um, and so it was just that connection of the cycle of life, and a reminder of how precious life is, and kind of the how short it is. But I wanted to say, Sean, too, that one of my regrets in life was I literally brought a microphone up to Wenatchee because I thought, oh, when my dad gets out of his surgery, I'm going to interview him for Baha'i Blogcast because my dad was a long time a Baha'i. He became a Baha'i in 1963. And uh, and I had been meaning to interview him for quite some time, but I'd interviewed my wife, I'd interviewed my uncle. I thought, well, I don't want this to be like nepotism central here, where Rainn's just interviewing his relatives, and so. But that's a great regret that I have. He had incredible stories, and um, he uh, he became a Baha'i in 1963. He had met a guy who was a Baha'i who told him about it just in Seattle. He was hanging out with these bohemians in Seattle, and my dad was going to the University of Washington. He was about 20, and met this guy who told him about it. And my dad kind of didn't think twice about it. And then my dad was crossing the street in downtown Seattle, and he had a mystical experience. He said that literally time stopped, and everything slowed down, and he looked around him, and he said, what that guy said was true. That guy talked about this new teacher. Um, he couldn't even remember the guy's name. It's like Bahalahuluhu, something like that. And a new spiritual movement on the planet, and a revitalizing spiritual force. And and he just knew it was true. And so he called the Baha'i Assembly of Seattle. They were in the phone book, and he said, I need to meet with you. And they said, well, we meet on Tuesday nights from 7 to 10 or whatever. And so he went in, and he said, I want to be a Baha'i. And they were like, well, you can't just become a Baha'i. They said, you have to, what do you know about it? He's like, well, nothing really. They're like, well, you can't do that. You have to study these books. You have to read these books, study them. We're going to quiz you when you come back and see if you know enough to become a Baha'i. So they gave him like the Kitabi Khan and the Gleanings and a couple other books. And they said, oh, and by the way, it's the Baha'i fast. So if you really want to be a Baha'i, you need to start fasting right now. And my dad didn't know what that meant, so he just stopped eating. And he stopped eating for 3 or 4 days, and then he was like passing out from hunger. And they didn't have Google back then. You couldn't just kind of go to a computer and say, how does the Baha'i fast work? And so he ate a Snickers bar, and he felt terrible, but he ate a Snickers bar. And he read the books, and he came back in a few weeks, and he talked about what he had learned, and they said, okay, you can be a Baha'i. And because this was earlier than the hippie days when lots of people poured into the Baha'i faith. He was kind of a little bit before that. And when my parents got a divorce when I was about two and a half, my dad went pioneering to Mexico, and mostly Nicaragua, Bluefields, Nicaragua, which is actually the same place, same area that Hooper Dunbar had pioneered a few years earlier. So he was going in, and a lot of people were like, oh, Mr. Hooper was here. And my dad had incredible stories of sailing up the rivers and creeks of the Mosquito Coast to teach the Mosquito Indians the Baha'i faith. A lot of them had never seen a white man before. He was in a little outrigger canoe. He got malaria multiple times. And he has just incredible stories from that time. And I was always begging him to compile his stories and write a kind of memoir of those times in the early faith. And he has some of them written down, but he never really fully wrote the whole thing down. But um, one great story was he went to this tribe, and they asked him, what is this baseball we've been hearing about? Baseball. And my dad was like, well, okay, I'll teach you. So he's like, teach us baseball. I'm like, okay. So he went out, and he got a tree limb, and he like carved it into a baseball bat, and he was looking around for balls. They didn't have any balls. They didn't have like tennis balls or any balls out there in the jungle. So, but he found this really hard fruit that was kind of like an orange, really hard. And he figured out that you could get about three good hits off of one of them before they exploded. Uh, and so he got bases, and they cleared out like a little, farming field, and this was going to be the field. And everyone in the village lined up, the grandmothers, the infants, and they all lined up. They all wanted to play baseball. And he kept trying to teach them the rules. And they got the basic thing about hitting the orange and running around the bases, but he couldn't get them to kind of understand, like, no, you're out if you do a throw here, and you can only run if it's an in. So he just let it go, and they would just hit the ball with the bat, and they would laugh, and grandmothers and infants would run all around. And he had a lot of other great stories, boar hunting. That was and then he was a great Baha'i teacher, and I always hear from people of like, oh, my uncle was the one who taught my family the faith, and he first heard about it from your dad in the early 70s at a fireside. And so there's literally, hundreds of people that can trace their kind of spiritual roots to Robert Wilson in the Washington area, um, especially in the early 70s, when people were interested in seeking a spiritual path and interested in becoming a member of a religion. So, and he was a painter and a writer. He wrote science fiction books. He wrote technical manuals, and he especially loved being a painter. He was never any good at selling his paintings or selling himself or going to gallery openings and meeting curators and trying to sell his stuff and hawk his wares. But he was a great painter. You can find his work online on his website and whatnot. And um, it's what another thing that's really interesting, Sean, for me is, I had a lot of issues with my dad. We had a complicated relationship. There were a lot of divorces. There were a lot of family ups and downs. Uh, and that being said, we worked that stuff out. We worked really hard on it. We even went to therapy together on some of the stuff that we had to work out. Um, and really, the last 10 years were very peaceful and loving and connected. And I'm so grateful for that everything had been said and everything had been laid on the table. And we were able to just really appreciate each other and love each other and support each other. And uh, But what was so interesting too is that when he passed, and when he was passing, and when he passed, I was not able to see his any of his negative qualities. I
Mm.
was not able to revisit, even in the slightest way, any resentments. All I saw, all I missed, all I witnessed, all I connected with was his positive qualities, which were numerous. Um, the joy he brought wherever he went. He was one of those people, like, if he went into a room, he always made it a better place. He would have a joke, he would have a story, he would be loving, he would bring support, he would bring encouragement to every room he went into. And I miss that. And I and marvel at that, in retrospect. Um, he always supported me in the arts. I wouldn't be an actor, an artist without his support. Um, He was incredibly kind, very gentle.
Are you
And
like
and
him?
the thing that really moved, I'm
Sorry.
sorry.
I'm sorry. I was going to ask you, do you see him in you? Are you like him?
I could be a lot more like him, honestly. I could learn a lot more from him. He's much more gentle and patient than I can be a little bit vociferous and impatient. I don't know if that's the correct use of the word vociferous, but hell, what the hell. Um, and I try and uplift a room. I try and be encouraging and positive, but he just did it so effortlessly and so naturally. And he had gone through, one thing that's warrants saying, like, his childhood was out of Charles Dickens. I mean, it was horrific how he was treated. His dad would leave him and his sister at home by themselves for weeks at a time without any food in the house. I mean, the stories just go on and on. Just horrific abuse that caused a lot of trauma, but it was amazing how he was able to move beyond that. But the interesting thing was, like, none of his negative qualities have even arisen in the slightest degree. And that really reminds me of this whole Baha'i concept of what you take with you when we leave these meat suits is our good qualities. Our negative qualities, and he didn't have many, don't get me wrong, it's not like he was this horrific guy, but just whatever issues we had, we leave that stuff behind. Taherzadeh was doing a talk on the soul, and he talked about how, negative qualities we have are like poverty. They're not something you bring with you. You can't go into a house bringing your poverty. You can't go somewhere, you're like, hey, take a look at my poverty. Like, you bring what you have, and what he had was so much positivity and love, and so that's what I'm witnessing as he's going on his journey.
There are so many metaphors in the Baha'i writing for passing into the next world. The bird that's freed from its cage. There are so many beautiful metaphors. When you wrote to me about his passing, you sent me one. The precious river has joined the mighty sea, and I thought that was so beautiful. And I wonder, how do you imagine him now? How have you thought about his passing? I've heard people talk about it, people graduating, but I wonder what it felt like. How do you imagine it?
Well, I wanted to read you that prayer that you just quoted. So let me bring it up here. This prayer I had never seen before, and Erica Toussaint Brock, who's a former National Spiritual Assembly member of the Baha'is in the United States, she lives in Oregon. She heard about his passing, and she sent this prayer from Abdu'l-Baha, and it goes, "He is God, O peerless Lord. Praised be thou for having kindled that light in the glass of the concourse on high, for having guided that bird of faithfulness to the nest of the Abhá Kingdom. Thou hast joined that precious river to the mighty sea. Thou hast returned that spreading ray of light to the sun of truth. Thou hast welcomed that captive of remoteness into the garden of reunion, and led him who longed to look upon thee to thy presence in thy bright place of lights. Thou art the Lord of tender love. Thou art the last goal of the yearning heart. Thou art the dearest wish of the martyr's soul." How did I experience him? Well, the thing I was going to say earlier, which just popped into my head right now, and I'll get to your question, is one last kind of ode to my dad, testament to my dad, and something that I really learned from him is, I've met hundreds, if not thousands, of Baha'is in my days, and no one that I've met, of course, we can't really know this, we can't quantify this inside, but no one that I'd ever seen had as deep a devotion and connection to Baha'u'llah as my dad. His steadfastness and his just deep rooted connection to Baha'u'llah, love for the personage, the prophethood, the mission, the person, prophet of Baha'u'llah was just unshakable. He would read from the Gleanings. He had the Gleanings by his bed. It was just dog-eared. He would read it over and over again. He would pray with incredible fervor. And he reminded me of the Dawnbreakers. My dad reminded me of some of those early believers. And just like I've just been reading about the story of Ahmad, who the Tablet of Ahmad was written for. Like his devotion was so pure-hearted. It was just absolutely unshakable. Um, and people come from the faith, they go from the faith, their faith is tested, they have issues here, they have issues there. Um, and I truly believe that it is our personal connection to Baha'u'llah that keeps our rudder moving forward. And we often lose that. We get caught up in social teachings and how to sum those up and the interactivity of Baha'i social teachings with the current social mores and social beliefs in contemporary society. And we kind of get in that world and lose that kind of, as Shoghi Effendi calls, that mystical connection that binds man to God, which is through the manifestation. But how do I perceive him now? It's interesting. I definitely feel like I have an ally on the other side, and I have definitely felt his presence at times. I felt it in the funeral. I felt it a couple of times. We went and visited his gravesite, and I've felt it when I've had times of expressing extreme emotion, um, and just a force of love. I picture him in the concourse on high, you know, as a force of love. Uh, that is there for me, like a love battery on the other side that I can connect to when needed. And I haven't gone there yet very much right now. I'm just kind of still reeling, and I'm frankly surprised that I could talk this much about him and not break down into tears. But um, I've just done a lot of processing of my feelings over the last couple of weeks, and yeah.
You're a dad now. How are you? How are you a father? How does your father affect how you're trying to be a father?
That's a great question. Um,
Do you sort of feel? Do you
I
feel him as
think,
a father as you're parenting?
you know, in the, I would say that the main thing that my father brought to me through my life was, when my parents got a divorce, I was 2 years old, and he wanted to keep me, and he fought hard for me, and uh, really believed that he needed to parent me, and uh, we have an especially strong bond because essentially I lost my mother at age 2 and stayed with my father. I really didn't see her very much till I was about 14 or 15. So he was always there for me. And I think that, like, that is one thing I want for my son to know and to feel, that I'm always there for him. I have his back. He can rely on me whenever he needs. And, that is a strong force. I mean, of course, I want to be more than that, but that was one thing when I look back on his life that I was incredibly moved by, that my father was always there for me if I needed support, if I needed love, if I needed a basement to stay in because I was unemployed, if, he never had much money, but if I needed a couple $100, he would send it to me. And, you know, um, and I want Walter to know that I'm there for him. And that is going to be unshakable.
I always think about how enthusiastic my dad was. How he just sort of was and is enthusiastic and sort of encouraging about what I do. And I never feel criticized. And that has been something that I aspire to. I'm not sure I'm good at it with my kids. I feel like I feel like I don't live up to that. But it's I have this sense in my always of that example around me. Just that sort of I
Mm,
aspire to be trying to sort of live up to that because I know how powerful that is to be just encouraged,
mm,
to be just to be we talk about unconditionally sort of love just for who you are. And I hear
yeah.
that in your voice. I hear that sort of that love.
And I forget who brought it up on the Baha'i Blogcast, but I've heard a couple of Baha'is talk about that word encouragement. Like, and someone said that, if the Baha'i faith could be summed up in one word, it would be encouragement. And you always get that from the greatest Baha'i teachers um, and kind of the wisest Baha'i exemplars. Um, and this is a good natural transition into your into your life, because tell us a little bit about your father, who is an actor, Philip Hinton, who I had the honor of getting to hang out with at a Baha'i conference in the Czech Republic about 10 or 12 years ago or something like that. But uh, how did your father become a Baha'i?
We're gonna
Let's keep it on the
we're
father's
gonna make
track.
this a conversation about fathers. Well, a great theme. So my father was born in the UK during the Second World War, and he and his parents, who were his father, who was an East End Jewish tailor from a great tradition of tailors who plied their trade in the East End of London, Polish emigres from
Mm,
the previous century, moved again and took the opportunity to go to South Africa. There was a period
hmm
where they were encouraging immigration from the UK. They would give them, can you imagine, would give them a pound to get on a boat, and they could get a passage to South Africa rather for a pound. And
mm,
he and his parents, when he was 1 or 2 years old, moved to South Africa and set up there. And my father grew up in Cape Town, where my grandfather set up a tailoring business. And my father describes a childhood. He loved his father very much and his mother, but they were quite distant from them. My father talks about being sent to boarding school a block away from the house they lived in, and that
mm,
he has, talked on many occasions with much emotion about seeing his father walk to work past the window from the boarding school and feeling, not understanding why they would, why he was there. And he grew up, and at school was told he wasn't smart. Was told he was good with his hands, but he'd never really amount to much. Was told that he was really discouraged all the
wow.
time during school, and in fact, didn't really didn't finish all his schooling and went off and started his career. Found he could act, and at a very young age found himself acting and doing work on radio, and he started working in the theatre and on radio in South Africa. And as a young man, 17, 18, beginning to work in the industry just from scratch. And in the course of that, he found himself working and helping a very renowned disc jockey on South African airwaves, a man called Lowell Johnson. And Lowell Johnson was one of the early American pioneers, Baha'i pioneers to South Africa. Now, in
Mm,
those days in South Africa, the apartheid system was so divisive that groups of people, as you know, Rainn, could only gather either as whites or as blacks or as coloreds, then called them the sort of the mixed race community. but they were divided along color lines so severely that it was sort of impossible for the Baha'i community to function in an integrated way and to function as it is meant to. And so the Guardian, having consulted with that community, told them that with much regret, because they were forced to really focus the efforts of this community on one or other, that actually they should not make efforts to teach the Baha'i Faith to the white community in South Africa. Instead, they should focus only really on inviting into the community people from the black community, regrettably having to make that decision, not, of course, wanting to. And so Lowell Johnson was working very closely with my father, who was an absolute jazz fiend and had got Lowell interested in jazz, and they did a program on jazz. And my father was unhappy, and he was young, and he was experimenting with ideas and with, lifestyle and all of these things, and he was unhappy and he was searching, and Lowell could see this. But Lowell wasn't meant to share his faith with this young man because of this color ban. And so what Lowell Johnson used to do was he used to write on little scraps of paper little passages from the Baha'i writings, not attributing them, and he would pass them to my father in the sound booth. And my father would read these and would find them so fascinating. Now, I don't know if you remember, but when we spoke a couple of weeks ago and I described to you how I found myself teaching the first young Baha'i in Mongolia under other straitened circumstances, I wrote little scraps of the Baha'i writings on a little piece of paper, and I used to give them to her. And it was in a direct memory of how my father learnt the faith, without knowing initially about the name of Baha'u'llah or about Abdul Baha or about any of the teachings of the faith, except for these prayers, that idea came to mind. And that's how my father became a Baha'i, and how he learned about the faith. And it was only when he decided that he was moving to the UK to pursue his acting career that Lowell was able to tell him about the Baha'i Faith, and he became a Baha'i. He declared at about 18 in South Africa as, I think, the first white youth to become a Baha'i in South Africa in the early days of the community, and then left a few weeks later to move to the UK, and found his way and got his first acting jobs and auditioned for the Royal Shakespeare Company, and with having met my mother in the theatre. My mother was a ballet dancer, having trained at the Royal Ballet School and worked in the ballet in London. She was a dancer in the musical show, in a musical that he was in, and they met, and they found this extraordinary shared love for the Baha'i Faith. And it was really, they got to know one another through my mother's exploration of the Baha'i Faith. And she became a Baha'i also. And 1963, just after the Universal House of Justice was elected, before they were married, they went on pilgrimage together. And I found in the guest book in Baha'i their two names and signatures, and they went as, I guess they were engaged at the time. They went on pilgrimage together at a time when only 9 Western pilgrims went on pilgrimage in any group. And the Western pilgrims were invited to sleep the night at the mansion at Baha'i. They used to travel out to Baha'i, and they used to sleep the night, and they would leave their names in the guest book, and then they would go and visit the shrine of Baha'u'llah. And so I found my parents, pre-married names there in that book. And I was born a few years later in Stratford-on-Avon while my father was at the Royal Shakespeare Company. And then we moved to Australia at about 7 or 8. I think, my father was working in the theatre. My mother, having had 2 of us, had sort of finished her ballet career. And I think it was tough. My father was working in the theatre, but he was a like all actors, regularly unemployed, mostly unemployed actor, even going from job to
Yep.
job. Most of your days and hours are waiting for the phone to call from your agent, and his life
Hmm.
was no different. But I think in the 70s in the UK, it was a tough time. It was tough economically, and young children trying to make a living in London. And I think my father, having grown up and been in South Africa and sort of looked to a new direction. And my parents decided they wanted to pioneer. And if you can believe it, in 1974, Australia was one of the countries in the world that needed Baha'i pioneers. Hard as it is
Wow.
to imagine that you could pioneer to Australia, but they did.
Yeah.
And they took their two little boys, and we got on a plane in Christmas in 1974. A whole bunch of reasons why we had to go quite suddenly, because the visa laws were changing. And I remember it so clearly. We went from this pelting rain and wind, and my mother in tears at the airport in Heathrow. And the next thing I remember was it was like 100 and something degrees, and we were staying with a Baha'i family in the far west of Sydney, and we couldn't have been more different. And we made our lives there in Australia, and
Hmm.
so that
Hmm.
was. And I grew up in a loving Baha'i family. I really did, and my parents have been. My father was. I mean, being an actor, it's difficult. It's such a difficult profession because you can't. You need so many other people and so many other circumstances to come together for you to be able to ply your trade. Unlike a musician
Hmm.
who, at least if he has his violin or she has a piano, you can make music. But an
Hmm.
actor needs all these other things, and so he slowly, made his way in the acting profession in Australia then, and tried to sort of rebuild a career in a new place, which is always very difficult. And I have many
Hmm.
memories of
Hmm.
I looking back on it, I realized that there were very difficult times for my parents, my
Hmm.
financially, and what an incredible sacrifice it must have been to have left a very exciting career in the UK and to go to this new place where you didn't know anyone and everything started from scratch.
Right.
But I look back on it and I realize those things, but I never experienced them. I just thought that my parents were having a fantastic time, and you know my dad thought it was just so cool that he was getting up early in the morning and was going to deliver milk, and I could go with him and do a milk delivery run. And looking back on it, I was like, wait, what a second. He was doing milk delivery run to make ends meet as a family in the early days. And yet it was just another great adventure that we were on. And so I have
Hmm.
very happy memories of childhood. And
Hmm.
like I
Hmm.
said,
We have
just,
that. We have that in common as well. My
yeah,
dad was worked all kinds of odd jobs, but for many years as a in a sewer construction company, doing sewer construction, and to support his family and to try and support his career as a painter and a writer. And I've thought of it the same way. Oh, cool! He's going to go work in the sewers, and
isn't
you
that
know,
wonderful? He
he
just
he,
made it
he
made
never
it made it
complained.
fun, right? Made it an adventure.
Right, right. So, Sean, I want to skip ahead a little bit and kind of dig into your life story now. So, thank you for that backdrop. And then you're a music student and a musicologist. And the thing I'm trying to wrap my head around, because really the focus of this podcast specifically, although I rarely state it, is the the union of one's work and one's faith, and how one's work in service and one's faith in service kind of dovetail and integrate, and the struggles with that and the successes with that. And your career, I can't even, it makes my head spin. I can't even keep up with it. You're a musicologist, and then you're working in film and also working in finance and then film and finance, and then finally working in the kind of nonprofit foundation sector. So, can you just talk me through that a little bit? Can you kind of fill us in? I know this is going through decades, but how do you go from a nerdy musicologist studying in Mongolia from part one to film and finance and this whole other world, George Soros, that you're working in?
I don't think I ever said I was a nerdy music. I imagine myself as a very cool musicologist, but I'll
You're a dapper,
thank you.
yes, yes.
I'll let you get away with that editorial. Yes, fair enough. Well, I'm gonna take it back to parents and say this encouragement again. I don't think my parents ever told me that I couldn't do something, so I never learnt not to not to be able to try something. It's a great gift. It's an incredible gift. That encouragement and that sort of sense of seeing possibility and not being afraid of failure somehow, I guess. So that's right. So I was a young kid, and I wanted to be an actor like my dad, and so I used to do that stuff as a kid. And then I found out there was a high school you could get into if you were a musician. It was a specialist musical high school, and I said to my parents, I want to go to this school. And instead of saying, well, that's not such a great idea because you don't actually play a musical instrument, which many parents might have said, they said, sure, go for it. Why not? You can do it if you want, if you're really going to work at it. So it turned out I did play. I played the recorder like every other little kid at school, but I had always been very good at it. And so I went and my parents got me some special lessons. And actually, it turned out I was very good at it. And long story short,
So you could have been a professional recorder player.
I was a professional recorder
You were
player.
a professional recorder
Not many
player. I
people
didn't know
know
such a
this,
thing
but
existed.
thank you. I did. Yeah, I did my undergraduate degree as a performance degree in early music as a recorder major. Somebody should have told me that I couldn't do that, but as I say,
Okay, do you have a recorder sitting there in that office
nope,
somewhere?
no, none at all. In fact, none in the Oxfordshire area. So unfortunately, I can't indulge you with that request. Sadly,
Oh, no, 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 no. We need to hear you play the recorder. This
another day,
is too good.
another day.
This is too good.
So I did. I went to the UK to do my undergraduate as a music student, and as you know, at the end of that, I had this episode in Mongolia. Way at the end of my time in Mongolia, having started a little business and married along the way, too many stories there to tell. We returned to Australia, and I honestly didn't know what I was going to do. Rainn, at this stage, I was nearly 30. And I had 2 degrees in music and had spent 7 years in Mongolia. And I had great stories, and people wanted to take me out and, ask me, tell the stories, talk about it, but nobody would give me a job. And so I interviewed for everything I could possibly find. I interviewed for a bank. I interviewed for an ad agency. I interviewed for, really, I was up for anything. And one job I interviewed through, someone I met at an event, was a management consulting firm, and they had an entry path for people with unusual backgrounds, and I was incredibly lucky, and I got into this very prestigious management consulting firm, and that was like a sort of a whole completely new chapter in my life, and I learned a whole new set of skills. And I found myself learning about finance and business and, building spreadsheets and advising companies. And a lot of the work that we were doing, and I was able to do because of my background, was in the media. So I was working with this management consulting company, and we were helping newspapers and television companies, and we were doing all of this. And so it was kind of not too much as a surprise when I left. I had this opportunity to go run a film studio. I was invited to leave this consulting firm and become the managing director of Ealing Studios, which is the oldest film studio in the world, predates Hollywood, and there was a group of investors that were buying the studio and sort of relaunching it. So I had a stint working in film and TV, and that was felt close to my roots. It felt, very satisfying to work in that area. But then, and from that, I had set up. I left and I set up my own little sort of advisory business that was helping people who were buying and selling media companies in the UK. And then we had this itchy feet again. And in fact, maybe in a parallel again with my parents, this idea of going to China arose. China was a place that we had been fascinated with. We had read about. We were, of course, from the time in Mongolia, we visited and went backwards and forwards through China many, many times. But really, it felt like a place that was changing and whose change was affecting the whole world. And it felt like just an extraordinary and exciting place to be. And so we made the decision, my wife and I, in the course of a 10-minute phone call once, without any planning beforehand. I was visiting Beijing, doing some due diligence on a company in China, and I'll tell you this story. And I attended a banquet, and at this banquet, for a launch of a property, new property, it was a kind of a big corporate event. I found myself sitting at this table, one of the high tables, and around this head table there were this incredible group of sort of chief executives and leaders, captains of industry, really a sort of who's who in that part of the world. It was an amazing group of people. And the conversation that I heard around that table really shocked me, because instead of people talking about their private jets and the money and the currency and the politics and things, I found that this group of people were talking about the moral education of their children. And they were talking about the soul of their country. And they were talking about spiritual ideas and things in a way that really shook me. It didn't meet my sort of preconceived ideas of that conversation in a place like China at a time like that. And I thought, this is just something special. This is an incredible time. And I had a real desire to be part of and be a sort of witness to what was going on in China. And I don't mean to suggest that that's all people do, but it was my experience of China in that time was that there was along with this incredible rise of materialism and this incredible sort of, economic growth, that rather surprisingly and unlike many other parts of the world, that there was an equal kind of explosion in the interest in spiritual matters and people turning and inquiring and being curious. And so that was just very exciting to me. And so I called my wife from the balcony of dinner, and I said, I've got it. What are we doing in London? We got to experience. This is amazing. And so my beloved wife, 10 minutes later, we had agreed that we would move to China. And so we did. We put our kids and then our 3 daughters and ourselves, and we moved out to Beijing. And we didn't have a job, but we figured that it would be an amazing experience. And that in the course of doing that, we would at least learn the language, and maybe we would come back to the UK a few years later if it didn't work out. And in the end, we spent 9 years in Beijing. And it was.
And there's always a yurt in Mongolia waiting for you in case you needed to just
I do have.
pop up there.
That's my golden parachute is to return to my goats in Mongolia. So that was China, and we went to China without a job, and so consequently, apart from enrolling in some Chinese lessons, we didn't really know what would happen next. And so, as it happened, the skill set that I had, that people were interested at that moment, at that time, the thing that I found work in, funnily enough, was connected back to Mongolia. And I found myself, as Mongolia was developing these natural resources and China was growing, I found myself strangely enough, if you can believe it, it was my knowledge of Mongolia, my fluency in the Mongolian language, combined with my background in consulting and finance, that was this sort of unique skill set at that particular moment. And, the thing that strikes me, Rainn, is how little we know about the future. We make plans so carefully, and we sort of strategize as if we know the different steps that we can take. But there's no college counselor could have told me, young man, the best way to get from studying the recorder to working in, mining is if you go to Mongolia and then, that's crazy, But my steps were, and I'll list them out because you listed them, but you left a bunch out, were I trained as a musician. I spent 7 years living in Mongolia, during which time I started a travel business. I joined a management consulting firm. I ran a film and TV studio. I worked in mining and natural resources with an investment bank. And then as we were finishing up in China with this strange sort of career, having gone from the right brain to the left brain to the right brain, having worked in, sort of socially oriented work to financial to, all these different things, I had a headhunter approach me with just an amazing opportunity that kind of brought all of those things together. And right now I work for one of the largest...
You're mining recorders.
I work for one of the largest foundations in the world, which is the philanthropy of George Soros, called the Open Society Foundations. And what's interesting about it is it's the only one of the top 100 foundations in the world by size that is named after an idea and not its founder, and not so it's so interesting, and it's named after this it's called the Open Society. It's this idea of open and transparent and plural societies. And so I head up I'm the co-director of all the economic justice and economic development work that the foundation does. In fact, that's an area of work that I created in the foundation. And I also head up the team that makes investments to advance the strategy. So we invest in companies not to make a profit in them, but we invest when there's a company that can do some good in the world. And so it's an amazing job that's brought together my desire to be of service to humanity, my professional skills, my sort of entrepreneurial experience, my sort of global view of the world. We work in 107 countries in the world as a foundation. So it's a job that brings all of those things in a sort of coherent way together. Sorry, that was a long answer to a question. You didn't think I was going to stop, did you? You said,
Wow, that's an incredible career path that you've had. And I guess one of the things it brings up for me is when I speak to young people, there's so much pressure these days for young people in high school and in college, university, to achieve, to get good grades, to get into the right school, then to get the right apprenticeship and the right internship and the right and I understand that the job market is very different now than it was when we were getting out of college in the 80s. And I often say, back when I was graduating from college, like, if you wanted to be an architect, you could go get a degree in an architect and get B's and A's, and you could graduate, and then you could just go around town wherever you lived and hand in your resume and get a job and be an architect. There wasn't it doesn't really work that way anymore. So there is this tremendous amount of pressure. But I love the idea that by the age of 30, you hadn't even found your career path. And I always say that to young people, just like, you know what? Take your time getting your education. You don't have to rush through it. You don't have to have the perfect internship at age 22 and the perfect job at 23. you'll find your path. Travel, see the world, read, meet people, gain life experience, and
Yes.
doors will open for you. Do you have anything to say on that?
Yes. What I have to say about that, Rain, is yes. And my poor children have heard me say this to them all ad nauseum. And I don't know whether whether I'm helping them and just being encouraging enough as a father, like we've been talking about, to just be supportive, because I desperately want that for them as well, and want them to have that space and feel, the privilege that you have when you're young to absorb and to do things and to travel and to simply explore the world, because I took full advantage of that in my own life, and can't help but think that it paid off and continues to pay off in so many ways. The thing that I thought of when you asked me that question was about, you know what we do when we choose, when we make decisions. That we often think that there is a sort of a trade-off we have to make. We have to choose the next job incredibly carefully, because one thing will give us more chances for service, or one will give us more chances for, and we think about these things in a very sort of zero-sum way. I tried I've experienced that too, as I've gone through my career, trying to make a choice and thinking, well, I which of these opportunities, which of these choices is going to give me, is this job going to have a better, opportunities for service? Is it going to? And I once asked this question of a very dear and a very special Baha'i, who's known to many of us, as he was a member of the Universal House of Justice for so many years, Mr. Ali Nakhjavani. And I had the opportunity to ask Mr. Nakhjavani about a particular choice I was facing in my life. And it was really about whether I should be, working with a big company, institution, sort of, one of these big, sort of corporate entities, or whether I should be out there in a small sort of startup environment and doing something that maybe I had much more freedom to sort of do things in a way that might be, consistent with my Baha'i ideas or values, as I imagined that. And he launched into a story about some historical figures in the faith. In fact, and was talking about their lives and about how they had these extraordinary lives of detachment, and how they had achieved all these extraordinary victories in the early days of the Baha'i Faith. And I was kind of mystified, and I have to think at one point I thought to myself, maybe he didn't understand the question. Maybe Mr. Nakhjavani is an extraordinary man, but maybe he sort of, maybe I didn't ask the question properly. And I went away and reflected on what he'd said, and I went back and I spoke to him the next day, and I checked with him, and what he was saying to me was that I was asking the wrong question. That to think that what matters is what we do is to ignore how much more important is how we do whatever it is that we do. And we focus all of our energy and all of our sort of feeling of control that we have over choosing what we do. Whereas in actual fact, how we show up, the degree of detachment we have, or the sort of desire we have to be of service to people, to do work performed in the spirit of service, as Abdu'l-Baha says, in a way that rises to be the highest form of worship, that fantastic quote of Abdu'l-Baha's, seems to me, and was what I took away from his answer, infinitely more important than the particular company or the particular place or even job that we hold. And, it's obviously it's easy to say, but I think it's true. It's even true at school. I think with my own children, we've put so much time and thought into sort of which school is going to be just the perfect fit for our children, and how we have the luxury of being able to sort of try and choose where we live in order to find the right school. Whereas in actual fact, how kids go to school, if kids go to school with the right attitude, with the thirst for learning, with the hard work, with the energy, with they can thrive almost anywhere.
Mm.
And so, and to me, that's a great leveler as well, because what it says is that you don't only get to be of service to humanity if you get this job or if you're in this particular place. It says that everybody can be of service. Everybody can contribute something special. And I think one of the great things that we've learned during COVID-19 has been that people we used to take for granted, people who are delivery drivers or bus drivers or, checkout folks at supermarkets, are performing work that's really vital to us, and they're doing it in a spirit of service. So that's something that's really affected me, and I guess in a way made me think less about my choice of job, and more about what I make of the opportunity that I have in front of me. It also has made me realize how precious the opportunities and the things that I do outside of work are as well. I mean, some of the things that give me the most joy in my life right now are these very local, opportunities for discussion and study and service and community that I have around me here in my neighborhood in Oxford. These, study circles that we do as Baha'is, and that we've been able to keep going through this pandemic lockdown by doing them virtually. But that person-to-person contact.
And I'm glad you're bringing this up, Sean, because this is something I wanted to ask you about from previous conversations that we've had. I know that you're very involved in Ruhi and devotionals and core activities and community building exercises. And, frankly, a lot of Baha'is that run multinational foundations either don't have the time or kind of feel that kind of work maybe is beneath them. And you're very actively involved in building community. So what does that look like for you?
Well, I have to do it on the weekends and, organize it in times when I'm not traveling. But then, the pandemic fixed that, so I don't travel anymore. One does have to work around one's travel schedule or one's work schedule. But it's funny, I find that whether it's participating in those core activities in the Baha'i community, whether it's, some other avenue of service, something happens when you spend time on those things that enlarges the time available to you. I don't know. It's not like one of those pie charts where you can spend 22% on family life and 27% on work, but somehow the pie gets bigger or something happens. I don't know. But that's been my experience. And I find that it's such a source of energy and such a source of joy that it kind of makes other things possible. Maybe it makes you more productive. I don't know what the maths of that is, to be honest. But it is true, and I have found, although I work on these very big projects on a very global scale, I'm increasingly finding that it's the small things that we do in our family and our local community, in these small study circles and groups as part of the Baha'i community and working with others in the community, broader community here in Oxford, that bring me the greatest joy, and I think are having change in the world. Genuinely, I have seen more and more how human connection and conversations between individuals, building ties and resolving tensions that are so deeply embedded in structures in society. Just think about something we're experiencing now, like the kind of extraordinary moment of, increased consciousness and awareness around, around racial justice. And it's so hard to know what to do at a big societal level, and it can be hard to know what to do in our jobs but in my community with the people that are next to me, with the human beings around me, I feel like we really can do something meaningful, and I feel that builds real change in the world.
My wife and I talk about teaching a lot, and it seems like teaching has shifted. Back in the 70s, you could have kind of the charismatic speaker give a fireside, and two or three people might raise their hand and say, I believe, I want to join, I want to be a part of this. But it doesn't work that way anymore. And in terms of teaching the Baha'i faith, and of course, the main focus of the community building grassroots exercises that Baha'is are doing, the institute process, core activities, whatever you want to, nomenclature you want to give them, is not to convert people to the Baha'i faith. However, for people to become Baha'is, they need to be nurtured and brought into a fold and brought into a family and loved and socialized with and study together and pray together and serve together. And that seems more and more for 2020 what people kind of need and want in order to have to consider calling themselves Baha'is or wanting to be a part of something larger. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, we are as Baha'is. What is the purpose of life? The purpose of life is to know God and to love God, and that we do that not on our own at the top of a mountain, but we do it by advancing our own spiritual progress through advancing the spiritual progress of mankind. That's our twofold moral purpose. Those are the two sort of projects we're working on, and they're kind of deeply integrated. And so being part of society and contributing and being of service to others and sharing with others the spiritual insights that we're finding and learning from them about theirs, that is a meaningful contribution to improving the world. And the work that you were describing as a father, and building our family, and making families that are more loving and more united and are more of service to humanity, that's a contribution. And so I think that it's in that spirit that we are also sharing with other people our faith and what we're learning about how to do that. Now, I recently did one of these study circles with a group here in Oxford, and what we call, you and I are talking about these like everybody in the world knows what they are, but the study circles, it's a sequence of courses that is really a way that the Baha'i community has developed for us to learn how to build community. And I see so many people desperate for community. They used to have immediate neighbors that they spent lots of time with who were a literal community that they lived in. But now they commute, or they live in one part of London and they get on a tube and they go all the way to another part, and they're not really part of that community. They used to have a sort of religious community. They'd be part of a synagogue or part of a church, and that was another sort of community that they lived in. And increasingly people are living disconnected from those. And they also used to have lots of family around and be used to having connection. And many people don't have that. They may live in another place, or the families are more dispersed. And so without all of those different types and layers of community, people feel terribly isolated. And in fact, one of the things I've observed is that they vest a huge amount of sort of hope and dreams in work being the community that they need to sustain them. And that's very hard. It's very hard for workplaces to be all that to people. So I think one of the things that we're doing in these courses is we're learning, how do you go about building community? And one of the ways you do it is you start getting to know people, and you do that by having meaningful conversations with them, not talking about the weather, not talking about this or that, but talking about things that are really deeply matter to you, to people. And then one of the ways you get to build community is you do things together. You go and serve, and you go and support others, and you visit people in their homes, and you get to know one another. And so, this sequence of courses is a way of learning how to build a community. What's a community in a box or something. And that's something that the world needs. And I think we've lost that. It's a lost art, how to build a community. And I think the Baha'i community is learning how to do that and trying to teach others how to do that as well.
So one of the things I ask participants in this podcast much of the time is, what is their greatest spiritual struggle? I think people like to keep it real. I like to hear like where the rubber meets the road. Like what are you having a hard time with? Is it a character defect or something you're working on? Share what's going on with you spiritually.
I need to listen more, talk less. That's a quote from Hamilton, and well, it's not a quote, but you know what I mean. It's from the wonderful show Hamilton, but it's also a very core concept in the Baha'i writings. That quote says that excess of speech is a deadly poison. The tongue is a smoldering fire, and excess of speech is a deadly poison. And I think that one of the things that I struggle with is that I think with my mouth open, and I try to understand the world by talking, and that often crowds out the space for listening. And I am constantly reminded of how much better the world is, and how much better I do when I listen, when I speak less, and when I'm able to ask questions more. And I love that quote from Hamilton. Talk less, smile more. Isn't that what he sings? What sings. And there's a truth. There's a real truth to that. That being joyful, listening, and speaking less. Although maybe I'm taking it out of context for the
in the context of Hamilton, that quote has to do with ingratiating yourself politically.
And it's absolutely not what I mean, obviously. But there is, the idea of sort of talking less and listening more, I think, is something I'm definitely struggling with, as you will have experienced on this podcast.
And tell us about the Baha'i Chair for World Peace. You're on the board, and that's at the University of Maryland. Can you give us a summary of what that is and the work that position fills?
What a privilege it's been for me to be a little tiny part of supporting that. Yeah. So this is one of the finest educational academic institutions in the US, at which a professorship, a chair, was created some years ago, called the Baha'i Chair for World Peace. And it was born it came in response to an extraordinary message of the Universal House of Justice called the Promise of World Peace, which you will know, and many of your listeners will have read, and if they haven't, I hope they will turn to. This was, just a seminal message of the Universal House of Justice, and it was an expose, if you like, and an extraordinary description of the importance of and the need for world peace, and indeed what the Baha'i teachings spoke to on this subject. In 1985, it was written originally. And so this chair was created in honor of that, and really with the vision of exploring that message and the Baha'i teachings on world peace and what they have to offer. And Professor Hoda Mahmoudi, who's had the chair for some years now, what she has done is quite an extraordinary thing. And the Baha'i chair is now a very vital and integral part of the academic and student life of the University of Maryland. And of course, what she has done in that chair is to examine, as the Baha'i writings focus us on, what are the sort of structural barriers to peace? And, one of those is structural systemic racism, and there are many others that she has been exploring. And it's been just a great privilege to see how the Baha'i community, well, rather the Baha'i chair and the Baha'i writings have been able to be a point of integration and contact between all of these different academic disciplines that are looking at different aspects of peace and of the barriers to peace that there are in society. And there is something about this Baha'i vision, this sort of holistic Baha'i vision, that draws all of those together. And so it's been a great. I'm part of a board of an international board that tries to support the work of the chair together with the university as best we can.
Is there more specific ways that chair is impacting the student body at the University of Maryland and the ideas behind that chair?
Yeah. So I visited the University of Maryland to attend one of the annual lectures of the Baha'i chair, and it was just after one of these, the area of Maryland, Baltimore, have been a series of terrible incidents of racial violence in recent years, as you know. And, the Baha'i chair was hosting its annual lecture, at which it had invited students from across the campus to talk about the issue of race and racism as a barrier to peace, and what would have to be overcome in order for peace to be possible. And there were more than 600 students in attendance at this annual lecture that the Baha'i chair was hosting. And one of the very special things is a tiny little anecdote, but I recall that before Professor Mahmoudi introduced the distinguished speaker who was about to speak, she rather surprised the speaker by, first of all, introducing the interns who had been working at the Baha'i chair and who had been supporting with the preparations for this event, and she called each one of them out by name and spoke about the studies that they were doing and the contribution that they had made. And I thought that not only was that event and the 600 students who were present and the distinguished academic speaker who was there, not a Baha'i from another one of the fine universities in America, not only was that event important and impressive to see what the Baha'i chair was doing, but the way in which Hoda Mahmoudi, the professor, the holder of the Baha'i chair, showed up, the way in which she held that, the way in which she raised up the least amongst them in an academic setting, which is, you rarely see that happen, was also, I thought, very powerful and a very, very important way of demonstrating what the Baha'i teachings are all about.
And does the chair look a lot like the Iron Throne from Game of Thrones? What does the chair itself look like?
Yes, the chair. The chair comes out once a year.
Is it made out of globes?
A whole series of planets welded together. Yes.
Yes. Sean Hinton, thank you. Are you a doctor in all those degrees you have? Did you get a doctorate in all this?
As my children remind me regularly,
Hinton?
No, you can call me that, but it would be incorrect. As my children remind me, I never finished my PhD. I never made it back from Mongolia to Cambridge to finish the PhD.
Okay, so not Dr. Hinton. Thank you so much for your time, and what a beautiful discussion. And I'm so glad we got to do two parts. We got to visit Mongolia. We got to pay a visit to both of our fathers and salute them and fatherhood spiritually, and talk about that intersection between work and service. So thank you for your time. I know you're a busy guy, and this has just been such a inspirational privilege speaking with you. Thank you so much.
Well, lovely. And thank you so much for making the time, right now in your life with all you're dealing with and processing. And it's a wonderful act of service to keep these podcasts going, because you have a loving and faithful audience who get so much from these. So it's a privilege to be
loving and faithful audience of about 3 dozen that really enjoy these podcasts.
Hey,
Most
buddy.
of them pioneers.
You got to take
Olivia.
it. You got to take it where you can get it. And
Exactly.
I hear people, my kids, when I said, "Hey," all joking aside, I said, "Hey guys, I'm going to go and do a podcast this afternoon." Oh, God. Yeah, I'm doing Rainn Wilson. You're doing Rainn Wilson's podcast? Wow, Dad, can I come in? Can I come in while you're on it? So don't you worry.
You've really made it. You know you've made it. All right, much love to you, Sean. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Baha'i Blogcast. Hope you enjoyed the episode and the conversation. Check out more fun Baha'i stuff on Baha'iBlog.net. Thank you so much, and good night.